So as we continue to watch the debates unfold on Capitol Hill over the next phase of coronavirus economic stimulus package, one of the major things which we are seeing that is hampering down debate in Congress is the fact that the Senate is possibly in play for Democrats. So you can see this report that came out a few days ago. Mitch McConnell has been warning Republican senators in Congress in the Senate saying, look, man, if you think that distancing yourself from Donald Trump is the right move for you, then do it. I won't hold it against you. So this is a massive, massive big deal, and it shows that Mitch McConnell is well aware of the fact that Democrats really could take over the Senate. You can see this headline again here, Mitch McConnell signaling to Senate candidates, distance yourself from Trump if necessary. So this is a really big deal. In fact, if you take a look at the map here, you can see why this is something which is worrying Mitch McConnell so much. So this is on the basis of polls as they stand right now. Now, I'm going to go through and categorize a few more of these on how I think they're going to lean, but if the polls are right, and if the election were held today, this is what we're looking at right now. We're looking at the Democrats picking up and getting to that 50-seat threshold. 4 seats here as essentially a toss-up here. South Carolina, one seat from Georgia, Iowa, and Montana, which would lead to a 50-50 split, which of course would mean that the vice president would cast a deciding vote. And if the polls are also right, then we're looking at a situation where Joe Biden wins, and of course that would mean that you'd have a Democratic VP. As you know, the vice president cast the deciding vote in the Senate, and so that of course would mean that the Democrats would have gotten control over the Senate as the polls currently stand. Now I'm going to go through and again categorize a few more of these here. Now I do want to quickly talk about here on Arizona. Some people are categorizing this as a toss-up. I am categorizing it as leaning to Democrats. So we know, for instance, Mark Kelly is a former astronaut. He's a former Navy aviator. He's very popular in the state, and he's going up against Martha McSally. One of the things we saw in 2016, for instance, was the fact that the Democratic ticket outperformed the presidential ticket on top for the Senate. So that's a really big deal, and it does suggest to us that, when we look at the polls for the state of Arizona, we need to keep in mind the fact that it's very likely that we could be in a situation where the polls are going to lean a little bit more towards the Democratic side. And we also saw that, of course, in 2018 in the primary run, where it looked like Kyrsten Sinema wasn't going to pick up the seat, but she did end up picking up the seat, even though the polls at the time were suggesting that she was going to narrowly lose it, but she ended up narrowly picking it up by about 2 points on election day. So you can see here, this was the polling from 2018. So the polls going into the election showed McSally up by 1 point, but then Sinema ended up picking it up and winning by 2.3 points. And again, we also saw last time around in 2016 with John McCain that John McCain underperformed a little bit compared to the presidential ticket. So that is very optimistic for Democrats when it comes to the state of Arizona. And again, you look at the polls right now for Mark Kelly versus, again, McSally. We are looking at a situation right now where Mark Kelly is significantly ahead. And again, that story of being an astronaut, of being a naval aviator, he may not have exactly the best policies in the world, but he certainly has a narrative, certainly has a story that is compelling to a lot of voters and that a lot of voters are interested in the state of Arizona specifically. So that is why I've characterized Arizona as leaning blue, because again, that's where the polls are right now, and that's where, if you look at the history of the elections in the state, I think that it's pretty likely. Now let's move into some of these more controversial seats. So North Carolina here, I have it as tilting blue. So this is a situation where it really could look like the state could flip, and this is a general trend that we've been seeing for a long time. We saw governor seats flipping blue, and we've also seen the state just in general shifting blue as the cities have grown larger and the rural areas have continued to be pushed out. And as the university system in North Carolina, again, continues to bring in new students, and those students end up staying in the state. And so, again, North Carolina is in the same way that Virginia is now significantly and strongly blue. North Carolina is now following that trend and shifting blue as well. Now, South Carolina is an interesting one. I have it as a toss-up right now because that's where the polls are. However, if I had to wager, I do think that Lindsey Graham is going to pull it out, even though I do think that Jamie Harrison is going to make a competitive run. But I do think that Lindsey Graham is ultimately going to pull it out. So I'm going to put it as tilt, maybe even as lean. I'm not quite sure whether or not it's tilt or lean, but I do think that I do think that Lindsey Graham will probably finally pull it out. But I do think that that is shaping debates right now, which is that Lindsey Graham, if you notice right now, he isn't in the headlines as much recently as he usually is. Usually Lindsey Graham is all over the headlines, especially when we're talking about debates about, some kind of bill getting passed. Lindsey Graham has been a little bit more quiet recently because he knows that he does have a competitive race on his hands in South Carolina. Now, when we move over to Georgia, it becomes quite interesting because, of course, we have the story of Kelly Loeffler, who was caught in the insider trading deal, and we also have David Perdue versus Jon Ossoff. Now, I do think that the seat is probably going to go red here. The general polls right now do suggest that that's quite likely. We've seen situations in Georgia where the top of the ticket seems to outperform in the opposite way as it was the case in Arizona. The top of the ticket does seem to be outperforming the bottom side of the ticket. So it could be a situation where it's more competitive on the presidential side, but then less competitive on the Senate side. So I do think that ultimately it probably will go red for that reason. But Montana is quite interesting. So we have a very popular governor going in the state of Montana. So I do categorize it as tilting blue. So that puts us over at 51. Now I do think that Joni Ernst is probably going to pull it out here, even though the polls right now are a little bit more competitive. So if I had to set it up right now, I think that this is the general map that we're looking at as of this moment right now, categorizing all of the races. I do think that Democrats are in a position where they could pick up 51 seats, and Republicans are all the way back down at 49. And of course, if the Democrats pick up the White House there, they're going to have that extra vote in deciding vote cases. So we could be really in a situation where Democrats are able to pick up the Senate very realistically on the basis of polls that you take a look at. So it could be a real situation where, again, the Democrats could take over the Senate. Now, this, of course, does leave room because it could be the case that the Democrats only pick up 50 seats but then win the White House and they ultimately have control over the Senate. So this is a really big deal, and I don't think that this is something which Republicans are taking lightly. I think they are really taking it quite seriously, and we are seeing this debate unfold as we watch debates about the coronavirus stimulus packages. One of the things that we saw Nancy Pelosi do is basically say, look, the ball's in the Republican court right now. The Democratic strategy right now is to let Republicans trip over their own shoelaces, let Republicans make their own mistakes, and not talk too much about arguing for specific policies, and let the Republicans, again, mess up, make their own mistakes, and it's absolutely working in terms of the polls. Now, there's another debate to be had whether or not that's a good strategy in the long run, because it does mean that Democrats are missing out on the opportunity to argue for specific policies. Now, you guys know my views. I think that's a problem. I think that Democrats should be actively arguing for things, even if it costs them a little bit in the polls. That said, that's not the strategy which Democrats are running on, and we have to be realistic about what the Democrats are doing, and what they are doing is something which is aimed at maximizing the polling output, aimed at maximizing the vote output in November, which of course is unsurprising because it is election year. I do think that the strategy would be quite different if it were not an election year. I think that if it were not an election year, we would be looking at a situation where Nancy Pelosi would be arguing at least for some policies. Would they be arguing for the policies that I might be more interested in? No, probably not. You guys know my politics. I'm a bit more on the progressive side of things, but I do think that we would be looking at a situation where Democrats would be quite more vocal about the policies that they're advocating for than what we're looking at right now. With the Democratic strategy, you guys know, they passed a bill like over a month ago, the HEROES Act, and then they let it sit quiet while we're waiting for Republicans to come up with their own negotiations. And so that creates a dynamic, it creates a situation where the Republicans look incompetent, like they're the ones who are unable to put their bill together, and the Democrats are sitting over here like, look, man, we got this bill passed a month ago, why don't you just get on board? And Nancy Pelosi's strategy right now is essentially to hope that the Republicans cave, that the Republicans decide, you know what, fine, we'll go along with a whole bunch of the things that you want, maybe not everything, but a lot more. And it does look like Republicans are likely to cave right now. We've seen over the past couple days a number of Republicans switching their votes, saying, you know what, I initially wasn't on board with this, but now I am on board with this, because they're looking at the possibility of losing the Senate. And also, of course, if the Senate goes, we're also looking at a situation where House seats are majorly in play. Because let's also look at this map again one more time, and let's talk about the fact that these are states right now, Republicans are having to defend in states right now that they should not have to defend in. They absolutely should not have to defend in states like Georgia, in states like South Carolina, and of course states like Texas, where while it may not be competitive on the Senate level, it does look like, we've seen a number of polls at this point, it does look like Texas is competitive on the presidential level, which of course means that it's competitive in a number of possible House races and state Senate races and state House seat races that it may not be competitive in normal election years. So this is an absolute disaster for Republicans because, of course, it means that their resources need to be spread even more thinly than normal. And so Republicans are really fighting it out right now. And again, we're seeing that frustration really boil over in the debates that are going forward about the next phase of coronavirus stimulus package. It's becoming a debate about whether or not they're going to be willing to extend the weekly unemployment insurance benefits. We know, for instance, that the $600 a week federal enhancement benefits expired a week ago, and Republicans seem unable, or at least unwilling, to extend those benefits, saying that they're very concerned about a few workers who are making a little bit more money than they may have been typically. And look, the fact that they're doing unemployment insurance in the first place was the Republicans' fault, because they kind of trapped themselves into this, right? Because now they're turning around complaining about the fact that a few workers are making a little bit more. But the thing that a lot of Democrats at least should have been arguing for, and a number of progressives were arguing for, was, look, well, what we should do is basically just back pay people's wages, like 70% or 80% of a worker's wage, and then basically pay the workers to stay home. That was the strategy that a lot of progressives were arguing for, and it's the strategy which, if Republicans had gone along with, then they wouldn't be in this conundrum right now. They wouldn't be in this massive quagmire where they're arguing and bickering over the fact that a few workers are making a little bit more than they were in their job when they were working, as opposed to now when they're staying home. And so it's a situation right now where, of course, we do know that, you look at the numbers, you look at the projections, you look at the fact that where the coronavirus is right now, we are going to need to stay home for a little bit longer. We are going to need to hold out a little bit longer. And when we do talk about reopening, we're going to need to be talking about significant investments to make sure that we can maintain social distancing, to make sure that people have masks, to make sure that people can stay safe as we do begin to progress into stages of reopening. America has not, like a number of countries in Europe, earned the right to reopen. We did not tackle this virus early enough. If we had stomped down on it quick enough, we may be in a situation right now where we could be talking about reopening quite seriously, but that's not the situation that we're in right now. We're in a situation right now where a few stages of our economy are beginning to reopen, but with massive needs for social distancing, massive needs for various gear and equipment, various kinds of plexiglass divides, masks, again, hand sanitizer, all these other things that unfortunately right now we don't see enough funding for. So that's the general situation which we find ourselves in right now, and it's really hampering down the ability to debate effectively, where a number of representatives are afraid of losing their seats, and so it is giving Democrats a lot of leverage in the negotiations right now, where Democrats can basically sit back and say, look, we passed this bill a few months ago, just go along with what we said, and you know that it'll get passed. And Republicans know for sure that they have to do something, but they don't seem to be willing to extend the uninsurance provisions and the various popular provisions in the bill. And so Republicans are, again, really in a bit of a quagmire. All right, you guys, that's the video. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing.